The Boeing 747 rolled down the runway, the sunset casting its light through the windows, reflecting a brilliant orange glow into the luxurious first-class cabin. Barron Trump reclined in his seat, his eyes gazing into the distant sky, unaware that in just a few minutes, a shocking incident would change everything. The peaceful atmosphere was suddenly shattered by an icy voice. "He has no right to sit here." All first-class passengers turned around startled. A man in a pilot's uniform stood in the aisle, his eyes filled with hatred as he stared directly at Barron. But what left everyone frozen wasn't his words. It was the cold hostility in his eyes. Barron wasn't just being ejected from his seat. The man was treating him as someone who shouldn't be on this flight at all. Passengers began to whisper. An elderly woman murmured to her neighbor, "What on earth is happening?" Nobody knew. But everyone could sense that a great storm was about to break. And this time, it wasn't just a simple argument. This was an open battle between power and justice. The warm golden lights in the first-class cabin of the New York to Los Angeles flight reflected off sparkling crystal glasses. Passengers enjoyed the tranquility, lost in their own thoughts. Barron Trump sat in a corner, silently observing the world outside through the window. He was unaware of the eyes watching him. But someone had been observing him for a long time. James Calloway. Standing behind the thin curtain separating the first-class cabin from the cockpit, the chief pilot watched Barron with eyes sharp as knives. His fists clenched, knuckles turning white. 3 years ago, the Trump administration had destroyed his career. A new federal law required all commercial pilots to undergo more rigorous physical and psychological testing. For James Calloway, it was an insult. A man who had flown for 30 years like him had nothing to prove to anyone. But when he stepped into the periodic psychological evaluation, an unexpected result had caused his career to be suspended immediately. The company had refused to let him fly for nearly a year, forcing him to undergo continuous testing, while younger pilots continued their careers unaffected. It was all because of Trump. And now his son was sitting right in front of him, enjoying first-class comfort without facing any consequences. James Calloway felt every muscle in his body tense with rage. He took a deep breath. No, he would not let this slide. Barron was still focused on looking out the window when the atmosphere in the cabin suddenly became suffocating. A few passengers instinctively looked up, sensing a strange presence. Barron suddenly noticed a shadow falling across his seat. He slowly turned his head. A man stood right in front of him, tall and imposing in his immaculate pilot's uniform without a single wrinkle. But his eyes, they weren't the eyes of someone on duty. They were the eyes of someone facing an enemy. The silence stretched on until James Calloway's deep, cold voice rang out. "You have no right to sit here." A simple statement, but laden with obvious hostility. The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. Barron raised an eyebrow, calm but sharp. "I have a valid ticket. Is there a problem?" James gave a twisted smile, devoid of any humor. He leaned down until his face was level with Barron's. His voice was deeper now, but carried a clear threat. "Damn right there's a problem." Passengers began to whisper, some frowning in confusion. A nearby flight attendant gripped her serving tray tighter, as if she wanted to speak up, but didn't dare. Barron remained motionless. He met James's gaze directly. "I've never met you, but it seems you have a personal issue with me." James gritted his teeth. His eyes were filled with contempt. "Not with you, with your family." His fists clenched until his knuckles turned white. 3 years ago, your father ruined my life. Today I can't let his son sit here as if nothing happened. Barron remained composed, but his eyes darkened. "So this isn't about flight regulations. This is personal." James smirked, his eyes blazing with anger. "You think privilege will protect you forever?" Barron slowly placed his water glass on the table. He looked straight at James, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "No, but I think the law will." Barron's words sliced through the air like a sharp blade. Everyone in the cabin held their breath. James Calloway stood still for a moment, then his face hardened. He no longer cared about the passengers' attention. He wanted Barron off this plane, and he would do it, at any cost. The first-class cabin sank into an eerie silence. Busy businessmen, powerful politicians, they all paused their activities, no longer focused on laptop screens or expensive wine glasses. All eyes were fixed on a single point, Barron Trump. He sat there, facing the man who was glaring at him with pure hatred. James Calloway didn't move. He was like a predator, waiting for just one sign of weakness to pounce on his prey. But Barron didn't back down. He had faced prejudiced looks all his life. But this time, it was different. This time, there was something truly dangerous in James Calloway's eyes. James's hand trembled slightly as if he was trying to contain an explosion of anger. "So, you think you're clever?" He emphasized each word, his voice low but threatening. Barron remained calm. He took a deep breath before responding. "No, I just think you're letting personal emotions interfere with a professional situation." Those words were like a match thrown onto smoldering ashes. James suddenly slammed his hand on Barron's armrest, making several passengers jump in their seats. Some passengers began taking out their phones, quietly opening their cameras. They knew something was terribly wrong. Personal emotions, huh? James smirked, but there wasn't a trace of humor in that smile. He leaned down even closer, almost whispering into Barron's ear. "You don't understand anything, kid. You think you can sit here, among these elite people, without facing any consequences?" Barron maintained his sharp gaze. "I don't think anything. I know I have the right to be here." James clenched his fist, trying to hide the loss of control spreading across his face, but he couldn't contain himself anymore. James took a step back, drew a deep breath, then lifted his head. And then he did something no one expected. He suddenly turned and strode toward the front of the first-class cabin. Passengers watched, curious about what he was planning. Moments later, the aircraft's intercom system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, our flight will be temporarily delayed due to a security concern." The first-class cabin erupted in murmurs. Barron narrowed his eyes. Security concern? He could sense something was terribly wrong. But before he could react, 2 airline security officers unexpectedly boarded the plane. Things were about to become more dangerous than ever. The 2 security officers moved straight to the first-class cabin, each step making the atmosphere even more suffocating. One of them, a tall man with short hair and an expressionless face, stopped right in front of Barron's seat. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Barron didn't respond immediately. He looked up at the 2 men before him. Behind them, James Calloway stood with his arms crossed, his lips curling into a defiant smile. Now, Barron understood. This wasn't just personal hatred. This was a trap. He glanced around the first-class cabin, seeing curious eyes, worried looks, and confusion. Several passengers had their phones out, recording. Barron took a slow breath, then turned to face the security officers. "May I ask why?" The officer's expression remained unchanged. "We received a report about a suspicious passenger." Barron raised an eyebrow. "And that would be me?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. The entire first-class cabin knew what was happening. An elderly female passenger sitting nearby suddenly spoke up, her voice full of rage. "This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. He's been sitting quietly the whole time. What possible reason could you have to remove him?" A man in a suit, apparently a businessman, nodded in agreement. "I've been sitting here the whole flight. He hasn't done anything wrong. This is a blatant abuse of power." But the security officers paid no attention to the protests. They were just waiting for Barron's reaction. If he resisted, they would have reason to use force. If he made a scene, they would turn him into a real threat. Barron looked straight into the officer's eyes. "I have nothing to hide, but I'm not going anywhere." His words made the space freeze for a few seconds. James Calloway narrowed his eyes, realizing that things were not going according to his plan. Barron remained seated, unwavering, unafraid. And then a voice rang out, cutting through the rising tension. Everyone turned around. An elderly man, with a weathered face and commanding voice, stood up from the back of the first-class cabin. He looked straight at James Calloway, his voice deep but sharp. "If anyone needs to leave this plane, it's you." The first-class cabin erupted. Passengers began speaking up, taking Barron's side. James Calloway never expected his plan would backfire like this, but he wasn't giving up yet, because he still had one last card to play, and it could change this flight forever. The first-class cabin erupted in whispers, outrage, and tension. The elderly man, who had just stood up in protest, took a step forward, his gaze sharp enough to pierce through James Calloway's soul. "I've flown hundreds of flights in my life, but I've never seen a pilot behave like you. This passenger has done nothing wrong. If anyone is causing trouble, it's you." James Calloway didn't move, but his jaw tightened. "You have no right to speak to me like that." He emphasized each word as if trying to hold on to his last shred of authority. The elderly man gave a slight chuckle, but it wasn't a friendly one. "Oh, really? Let me tell you something. I'm a retired U.S. Air Force general, and I have every right to recognize an abuse of power when I see it." The first-class cabin fell into stunned silence. Barron tilted his head slightly, observing the man with great interest. James Calloway hesitated for a moment, but quickly regained his defiant attitude. "That doesn't change the fact that this passenger needs to leave." Barron slowly stood up. His tall figure made the cabin seem even more cramped. He faced James Calloway directly. "I'm not going anywhere. Do you know why?" James crossed his arms, his eyes full of challenge. "Enlighten me." "Because you don't have the authority to make that decision." Barron looked at the two security officers who were still standing and waiting. "Tell me, what report brought you onto this plane?" The two officers glanced at each other. One of them spoke up. "We received a report about a disruptive passenger showing signs of threatening behavior." Barron nodded slightly. "And who made this report?" The officer glanced at James. "He made no attempt to hide the truth. I reported it." Barron smiled slightly. "So no other complaints, no passengers called security, no incidents except for you yourself?" The atmosphere in the cabin became silent once again. Suddenly realized he was in a disadvantageous position. Barron turned to the surrounding passengers, his voice echoing throughout the cabin. "Has anyone here seen me causing any disruption?" No one spoke. Then a voice rang out. "No." It was the elderly woman from earlier. Then another person. "He hasn't done anything wrong. I've seen everything from start to finish. This is an absolute abuse of power." The voices of support grew louder and louder. James Calloway clenched his fists. "None of you understand. This is a security matter." Barron looked straight at him. "No, this is your personal matter." At this point, the security officer standing in the middle of the cabin began to understand the situation. He stepped forward, facing James. "Sir, I'm afraid you are the one causing disruption." James widened his eyes in disbelief. "Are you kidding me? I'm the captain. This is my plane." Barron crossed his arms, staring directly at him. "No, this is the airline's flight. And right now, you are the one making passengers feel unsafe." James opened his mouth to object, but then a voice came through the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the airline's chief dispatcher. We have received information about the situation on this flight." The entire first-class cabin fell silent. The announcement continued. "After carefully reviewing evidence from passengers and crew, we are ordering pilot James Calloway to leave the cockpit immediately. Another pilot will take over the flight." The first-class cabin erupted in astonishment. James stood frozen. He couldn't believe it. He had lost. The two security officers exchanged glances, then stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to leave the aircraft." James stood frozen, his eyes darkening. He turned to Barron, his eyes blazing with anger. "You'll regret this." Barron didn't blink. "Maybe, but today, you're the one who has to leave." Gritted his teeth, knowing he had no other choice. He was escorted off the plane under the stunned gazes of passengers. As soon as the cabin door closed, applause erupted throughout first class. Exhaled in relief, then sat back down. The elderly man, the retired Air Force general, turned to him, patting his shoulder gently. "Young man, you handled that brilliantly." Barron nodded, but in his eyes there remained a trace of contemplation. Because he knew this battle wasn't over yet. The flight continued its journey, but what happened in first class that day would never be forgotten. The video capturing the entire incident quickly went viral on social media. Hashtags Justice for Barron and pilot abuse became trending topics. James Calloway was indefinitely suspended, but Barron understood that this wasn't just his story. How many people out there had faced injustice with no one to stand up for them? How many had to remain silent in the face of abuse of power just because they had no voice? And what would have happened if today no one had dared to speak up for the truth? He looked out the window, watching the sunset sink below the horizon. And he knew, sometimes it only takes one person to stand up to change the world. The flight continued its journey, but the atmosphere in first class remained tense. Barron Trump leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window. Under the sunset, the sky stretched into a brilliant orange-red, like a sign of the major change that had just occurred. The surrounding passengers were still buzzing with conversation. Some couldn't believe they had just witnessed a pilot being expelled from his own flight. Others, those who had stood by Barron, looked at him with eyes full of respect. The retired general sat down in his seat, but before that he patted Barron's shoulder. "You stood your ground. Not many people can do that." Barron nodded, but in his heart something still felt unsettled. He pulled out his phone and opened social media. The news had exploded. A video over 5 minutes long capturing the entire incident was being shared at a breakneck pace. Millions of views, thousands of comments. Barron scrolled through the first headlines. Pilot suspended after attempting to abuse authority on commercial flight. Barron Trump targeted just for bearing the Trump name? Social media erupts, demands investigation into pilot's misconduct. Barron sighed, not from worry, but because he knew this was only the beginning. The flight landed in Los Angeles right on schedule. As Barron stepped out of the first-class aisle, camera flashes erupted from all directions. The press was already there. A swarm of reporters waited just outside the arrival gate, microphones raised high, cameras flashing continuously. "Barron, what exactly happened on that flight? Do you think you were targeted for political reasons? Will you be suing the airline?" Barron didn't respond immediately. He knew that speaking now could cause things to spiral out of control. Suddenly, a hand rested gently on his shoulder. It was the retired general. He nodded slightly as if to say Barron had done the right thing. With a slight smile, he said just one thing. "I believe in truth, and truth will speak for itself." That statement wasn't an accusation, but it was a sharp message. While news exploded across the world, in a dark hotel room near the airport, James Calloway was watching everything. On the TV screen, the video of him being escorted off the plane by security was playing on repeat. His face still showed clear signs of humiliation. He had lost everything. A pilot with 30 years of experience like him suspended after just one flight. He couldn't accept that. He threw the remote onto the table, clenching his fists. "You think you've won, Barron Trump?" He pulled out his phone, dialing a contact. The phone rang several times before a deep voice answered. "I knew you'd call. What is it?" James took a deep breath, his voice turning ice cold. "I need your help with something that this time no one will come back from." Silence on the other end for a moment, then that voice chuckled. "I'm listening." The TV continued showing Barron leaving the plane to passengers. Applause. But behind the scenes, a new conspiracy was taking shape. And this time, it wouldn't end with just one flight. It could change everything. This was no longer about first class. This was a battle on a much larger scale. And Barron Trump had no idea what he was about to face. Will James Calloway stop? Should Barron Trump speak up or keep silent? Is this just a personal incident or part of a bigger conspiracy? Leave your comments below, and don't forget to share this story because justice cannot be silenced.